3.6 Comparison and Contrast. Comparison in writing discusses elements that are similar, while contrast in writing discusses elements that are different. Therefore, a compare and contrast essay then analyzes two subjects by examining them closely and comparing them, contrasting them, or both. The key to a good compare and contrast essay is to choose two or more subjects that connect in a meaningful way. The purpose of conducting the comparison or contrast is not to state the obvious, but rather to illuminate subtle differences or unexpected similarities. Be forewarned. In order to compare and contrast, one must have a basis for comparison. The assurance that two items have enough in common to justify a comparison. You guys have heard the old adage, don't compare apples to oranges. Well, basis for comparison. That's how that comes into play. An analogy is often used in a compare and contrast essay. An analogy explains one thing by comparing it to a second, more familiar thing. For example, if you want to speak about nuclear fusion, you may compare it to a tea kettle. Next, the structure of comparison and contrast essay. The compare and contrast essay starts with a thesis that clearly states the two subjects that are to be compared, contrasted, or both, and the reason for doing so. The thesis could lean more toward comparing or contrasting. Remember, the point of comparing and contrasting is to provide useful knowledge to the reader. Now, there are two ways to structure a compare and contrast essay. One is the subject by subject, and the second is point by point. Your subject by subject is a comparison and contrast essay that writes a separate section about each subject and then discusses the same points for both subjects. This particular model emphasizes overall similarities and differences. The point by point is a compare and contrast essay where one makes a point about one subject and then follows it with a comparable point about the other. This particular model emphasizes individual points of similarity or difference. To me, that's super hard to understand, so I made a little example. So let's pretend our thesis sentence is dogs and cats. We are going to compare and contrast dogs and cats. And we are going to look at these three, these three things about them. Their temperament, their trainability, and upkeep. So in a subject by subject mode, you will notice our first paragraph, we're going to do a brief introduction. Dogs and cats are both domesticated animals that live in the house. So you're just going to do like a basic little, introduction to the topic. And then you're going to have your thesis sentence in the introduction where you say, when comparing and contrasting dogs and cats, one could look at their temperament, trainability, and upkeep. So then the second paragraph in the subject by subject, you are only going to talk about dogs. You're going to talk about dogs' temperament, their trainability, and their upkeep. In the next paragraph, you are only going to talk about the subject of cats. You're going to talk about their temperament, trainability, and upkeep. And then at the end, you're going to have a lovely concluding paragraph. Now, when you hop over here to point by point, you again will have your general introductory paragraph. When one decides between a dog or a cat, okay, and then the difference between the subject by subject and point by point here is that we are going to begin with each of our thesis sentences, smaller little topics. We're going to talk about temperament. We're going to talk about dogs and cats. And then the next paragraph, we're going to talk about trainability. And we're going to put dogs besides cats and talk about them. Upkeep, we're going to talk about dogs and cats. And then in the conclusion, we're going to have a general, dogs do this, cats do this. That's why dogs are superior, because they are. Dogs are awesome.